Chapter 9 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 9. A Night Ride in the Woods, the Encampment, Larry's First Attempt to Dig for Gold, An Alarm, a Suspicious Stranger, Queer Creatures. In less than 2 hours the travellers reached the second ranch, which was little better in appearance or accommodation than the one they had left. Having no funds, they merely halted to water their animals, and then pushed forward. The country became more and more undulating and broken as they advanced, and beyond the second ranch assumed the appearance of a hill country. The valleys were free from trees, though here and there occurred dense thickets of underwood, in which Maxton told them that grizzly bears loved to dwell, a piece of information that induced most of the party to carry their rifles in a handy position, and glance suspiciously at every shadow. Large oaks and bay trees covered the lower slopes of the hills, while higher up the white oak and fir predominated. About an hour after midnight the moon began to descend towards the horizon, and Ned Sinton, who had been unanimously elected commander of the little band, called a halt in the neighbourhood of a rivulet, which flowed round the base of an abrupt cliff, whose sides were partially clothed with scrubby bushes. "We shall encamp here for the night, comrades," said he, dismounting. "Here is water and food for our nags, a fine piece of greensward to spread our blankets on, and a thick-leaved oak to keep the dew off us. Now, Maxton, you are an old campaigner, let us see how soon you'll have a fire blazing." "I'll have it ready before you get the camp kettles and pans out," answered Maxton, fastening his horse to a tree, seizing an axe, and springing into the woods on the margin of the stream. "And Captain Bunting," continued Ned, "do you water the horses and mules. Our vaquero will help you. Jones will unpack the provender. Tom Collins and I will see into getting supper ready." "And may I ask, Commodore," said Larry O'Neil, touching his hat, "what I'm to do?" "Keep out of everybody's way, and do what you pleases, Larry." "Which manes I'm to make meself generally useful. So here goes." And Larry, springing through the bushes, proceeded to fulfil his duties, by seizing a massive log which Maxton had just cut, and heaving it on his powerful shoulder, carried it to the camp. Each was immediately busied with his respective duties. Bustling activity prevailed for the space of a quarter of an hour, the result of which was that, before the moon left them in total darkness, the ruddy glare of a magnificent fire lighted up the scene brilliantly, glanced across the sunburnt faces and vivid red shirts of our adventurers, as they clustered round it, and threw clouds of sparks in among the leaves of the stout old oak that overspread the camp. "Now, this is what I call uncommon jolly," said Captain Bunting, sitting down on his saddle before the cheerful blaze, rubbing his hands and gazing round, with a smile of the utmost benignity on his broad hairy countenance. "It is," replied Maxton, with an approving nod. "Do you know, I have often thought, captain, that an Indian life must be a very pleasant one." "Of course it must," interrupted Larry, who at that moment was luxuriating in the first rich, voluminous puffs of a newly filled pipe. "Of course it must, if it's always like this." "Ay," continued Maxton, "but that's what I was just going to remark upon. It's not always like this. As a general rule, I have observed men who are new to backwoods life live at first in a species of terrestrial paradise. The novelty and the excitement cause them to revel in all that is enjoyable, and to endure with indifference all that is disagreeable; sometimes even to take pleasure in showing how stoically they can put up with discomfort. But after a time the novelty and excitement wear away, and then it is usual to hear the praises of Indian life spoken of immediately before and immediately after supper. Towards midnight, particularly if it should rain, or mosquitoes be numerous, men change their minds, and begin to dream of home if they can sleep, or to wish they were there if they can't." "Get out, you horrid philosopher," cried Tom Collin, as he gazed wistfully into the iron pot whose savoury contents, i.e. pork, flour, and beans, he was engaged in stirring. "Don't try to dash the cup of romance from our lips ere we have tasted it. Believe me, comrades, our friend Maxton is a humbug. I am an old stager myself, have lived the life of an Indian for months and months together, and I declare to you, I'm as jolly and enthusiastic now as ever I was." "That may be quite true," observed Maxton, "seeing that it is possible you may have never been jolly or enthusiastic at all; but even taking your words as you mean them to be understood, they only tend to enforce what I have said, for you know, the exception proves the rule." "Bah, you sophisticator!" ejaculated Tom, again inspecting the contents of the pot. "Och, let him spake and be aisy," remarked Larry, with a look of extreme satisfaction on his countenance. "We're in the novelty and excitement stage o' life just now, and faix we'll kape it as long as we can. Hand me a cinder, Bill Jones, and don't look as if you was meditating what to say, for you know that you can't say nothin'." Bill took no further notice of this remark than to lift a glowing piece of charcoal from the fire with his fingers, as deliberately as if they were made of iron, and hand it to O'Neil, who received it in the same cool manner, and relighted his pipe therewith. "It strikes me we shall require all our jollity and enthusiasm to keep up our spirits if we don't reach the diggings to morrow," said Ned Sinton, as he busied himself in polishing the blade of a superb hunting knife, which had been presented to him by a few college friends at parting. "You all know that our funds are exhausted, and it's awkward to arrive at a ranche without a dollar to pay for a meal; still more awkward to be compelled to encamp beside a ranche and unpack our own provisions, especially if it should chance to be a wet night. Do you think we shall manage to reach the diggings to morrow, Maxton?" "I am certain of it. 12 miles will bring us to Little Creek, as it is called, where we can begin to take initiative lessons in gold washing. In fact, the ground we stand on, I have not a doubt, has much gold in it, but we have not the means of washing it yet." Larry O'Neil caught his breath on hearing this statement. "Do you mane to tell me," he said slowly and with emphasis, "that I may be sitting at this minute on the top of rale gold?" "You may be," answered Maxton, laughing. "When you don't know," remarked Bill Jones, sententiously, removing the pipe from his lips and looking fixedly at his messmate, "when you don't know what's under you, nor the course o' nature, which is always more or less a doing things uncommon and out o' the way, you shouldn't ought to speculate on what you know nothin' about, until you find out how's her head, and which way the land lies. Them's my sentiments." "Halloo, Larry!" cried the captain and Tom Collins simultaneously. "Look out for the kettle, it'll boil over." Larry's feelings had been deeply stirred at that moment, so that the union of the sudden shout with the profundity of Bill's remark had the effect of causing him to clutch at the tea kettle with such haste that he upset it into the fire. "Bad luck to you!" "Clumsy fellow!" ejaculated Ned. "Off with you to the creek and refill it." Larry obeyed promptly, but the mischance after all was trifling, for the fire was fierce enough to have boiled a 20-gallon cauldron in a quarter of an hour. Besides, the contents of the iron pot had to be discussed before the tea was wanted. In a few minutes supper was ready, and all were about to begin, when it was discovered that O'Neil was missing. "Ho, Larry! Come to supper," shouted one. "Hi, where are you?" cried another. But there was no reply until the captain put both hands to his mouth, and gave utterance to the nautical halloo with which, in days gone by, he was wont to hail the look out at the main top. "Ay, ay, comin', sir," floated back on the night wind, and shortly afterward the Irishman stumbled into camp with his hands, his face, and his clothes plentifully bedaubed with mud. "Why, what have you been about?" inquired Ned. "Diggin' for goold, sure. I've made a hole in the banks of the creek with me 2 hands that you might bury a young buffalo in, and sorra a bit o' goold have I got for me pains." A general laugh greeted the enthusiastic digger as he wiped his hands and sat down to supper. "Musha! If I didn't git goold, I've dug up a mortial big appetite anyhow. Hand me the wooden spoon, Mister Collins. It's more the gauge o' me pretty trap than the pewter ones. Do you know, comrades, I'm a'most sure I seed an Injun in the bush. If it wasn't, it was a ghost." "What like was he?" "Look there, and judge for yourselves," cried O'Neil, jumping suddenly to his feet, and pointing towards the wood, where a solitary figure was seen dimly against the dark background. Every man leaped up and seized his weapons. "Who goes there?" shouted Ned, advancing toward the edge of the circle of light. "A friend," was the reply, in English. Relieved to find that he was not the advance guard of a band of savages, Ned invited the stranger to approach, and immediately he stepped within the sacred circle of the camp fire's light. This unexpected addition to the party was by no means a pleasant one. His complexion was exceedingly dark, and he wore a jet black beard. In manners he was coarse and repulsive, one of those forbidding men who seem to be born for the purpose of doing evil in whatever position of life or part of the world they happen to be placed. The rude garments of the miner harmonised with the rugged expression of his bearded and bronzed face, and the harsh voice in which he addressed the party corresponded therewith. "I suppose you'll not object to let me rest by your fire, strangers," he said, advancing and seating himself without waiting for a reply. "You're welcome," answered Ned, curtly, for he neither liked the manners nor the aspect of the man. "You might ha' wished us the top of the morning, I think," suggested Larry. "Here, try and soften your spirits with a sup," he added, pushing a pewter plate of soup and a spoon towards him. The man made no reply, but ate ravenously, as if he had been starving. When he had finished, he lighted his pipe, and drew his knees up to his chin as he warmed his hands before the blaze. Little information of any kind could be drawn out of this taciturn wanderer. To Ned's questions he replied that he had been at the diggings on the Yuba River, which he described as being rich; that he had made enough gold to satisfy all his wants, and was on his way to San Francisco, where he intended to ship for England. His name, he said, was Smith. He carried a short rifle, with a peculiarly large bore, and a heavy hunting knife, the point of which was broken off. This last Bill Jones observed, as the man laid it down, after cutting up some tobacco, preparatory to refilling his pipe. "A good knife. How did you break it?" inquired Bill, taking up the weapon and examining it. "Never you mind," answered the man, snatching it rudely from him, and sheathing it. At this O'Neil regarded him with an angry expression. "Faix, if ye wouldn't live and so to spake in me own house, I'd make ye change your tone." "I don't mean no offence," said Smith, endeavouring to speak a little less gruffly. "The fact is, gents, I'm out o' sorts, 'cause I lost a grizzly bar in the hills an hour or two agone. I shot him dead, as I thought, and went up and drove my knife into his side, but it struck a rib and broke the p'int, as ye see, and almost before I could get up a tree he was close up behind me. He went away after a while, and so I got clear off." To the immense satisfaction of every one, this disagreeable guest arose after finishing his pipe, knocked the ashes out, shouldered his rifle, and, bidding his entertainers good night, re entered the forest and disappeared. "You're well away," remarked Tom Collins, looking after him. "I couldn't have slept comfortably with such a fellow in camp. Now then, I'm going to turn in." "So am I," said Maxton, rolling himself in a blanket, and pillowing his head on a saddle without more ado. In a few minutes the camp was as silent as it had previously been noisy. Captain Bunting's plethoric breathing alone told that human beings rested on that wild spot, and this, somewhat incongruously united with the tinkling of the rivulet hard by, and the howling of coyotes, constituted their lullaby. During the night the most of the travellers were awakened once or twice by a strange and very peculiar sensation, which led them to fancy the earth on which they reposed was possessed of life. The lazy members of the party lay still, and dreamily wondered until they fell asleep. Those who were more active leaped up, and, lifting their blankets, gazed intently at the sward, which darkness prevented them from seeing, and felt it over with their hands, but no cause for the unwonted motion could be discovered, until the light of dawn revealed the fact that they had made their beds directly above the holes of a colony of ground squirrels, which little creatures, poking upwards with their noses in vain attempts to gain the upper world, had produced the curious sensations referred to. Rough travelling, however, defies almost all disadvantages in the way of rest. Tired and healthy men will sleep in nearly any position, and at any hour, despite all interruptions, so that when our friends rose at daybreak to resume their journey, they were well refreshed and eager to push on. CHAPTER 9. The Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 10. Game and Cookery. Arrival at the Diggings. Little Creek. Law and Order in the Mines. Nooning at Little Creek. Hard Up. Our adventurers get credit and begin work. A Yankee outwitted. Deer, hares, crows, blackbirds, magpies, and quails were the creatures that bounded, scampered, hopped, and flew before the eyes of the travellers at every step, as they wended their way pleasantly, beneath a bright morning sun, over the hills and through the lesser valleys of the great vale of the Sacramento. And all of these creatures, excepting the crows and magpies, fell before the unerring and unexpectedly useful blunderbuss of Captain Bunting, passed a temporary existence in the maw of the big iron pot, and eventually vanished into the carnivorous jaws of Ned Sinton and his friends. Crows were excluded from their bill of fare, because the whole party had an unconquerable antipathy to them, and Larry said he had "aten many pies in his lifetime, but he had niver aten magpies, and he'd be shot if he was going to begin now." The duties of chief hunter devolved upon the captain, first, because he was intensely fond of shooting, and secondly, because the game was so plentiful and tame that it was difficult to avoid hitting something if one only fired straight before one. For the same reasons the blunderbuss proved to be more effectual than the rifle. The captain used to load it with an enormous charge of powder and a handful of shot, swan shot, 2 sizes of duck shot, and sparrow hail, mixed, with an occasional rifle ball dropped into the bargain. The recoil of the piece was tremendous, but the captain was a stout buffer, if we may be permitted the expression, and stood the shock manfully. Stewed squirrels formed one of their favourite dishes. It was frequently prepared by Tom Collins, whose powers in the culinary department proved to be so great that he was unanimously voted to the office of chef de cuisine, Bill Jones volunteering, and being accepted to assist in doing the dirty work. For it must be borne in mind that the old relations of master and man no longer subsisted amongst any of the travellers now, excepting always the native vaquero. All were equal at starting for the diggings, and the various appointments were made by, and with, the consent of the whole party. Little Creek diggings were situated in a narrow gorge of the mountains, through which flowed a small though turbulent stream. The sides of the hills were in some places thickly clothed with trees, in others they were destitute not only of vegetation but of earth, the rock on the steeper declivities of the hills having been washed bare by the periodical heavy rains peculiar to those regions. Although wild and somewhat narrow, this little valley was nevertheless a cheerful spot, in consequence of its facing almost in a southerly direction, while towards the east there were several wide and picturesque gaps in the hills, which seemed to have been made for the express purpose of letting the sun shine the greater part of the day upon the diggers while they were at work; an advantage, no doubt, when the weather was cool, but rather the reverse when it was hot. The entrance to Little Creek was about 2 miles wide, undulating and beautifully diversified, resembling pleasure grounds rather than a portion of the great wilderness of the far west. But the vale narrowed abruptly, and about 3 miles further into the mountains became a mere gap or ravine, through which the streamlet leaped and boiled furiously. It was an hour before noon when our travellers came suddenly upon the wide entrance to the valley. "How beautiful!" exclaimed Ned, as he reined up to gaze in admiration over the flowering plain with its groups of noble trees. "Ay," said Maxton enthusiastically, "you may well say that. There may be perchance as grand, but I am certain there is not a grander country in the world than America. The land of the brave and free." Ned did not assent at once to the latter part of this proposition. "You forget," he said, hesitatingly, as if disinclined to hurt the feelings or prejudices of his new friend, "you forget that it is the land of slaves." "I confess that I did forget that at the moment," answered Maxton, while the blood mounted to his forehead. It is the foulest blot upon my country's honour; but I at least am guiltless of upholding the accursed institution, as also are thousands of my countrymen. I feel assured, however, that the time is coming when that blot shall be wiped away." "I am glad, my friend," said Ned heartily, "to hear you speak thus. To be frank with you, I could not have prevailed upon myself to have held out to you the hand of intimate friendship had you proved to be a defender of slavery." "Then you'll form few friendships in this country," said Tom Collins, "for many of the Yankees here have been slaveholders in their day, and almost all defend the custom." The conversation was interrupted at this point by Larry O'Neil uttering a peculiarly Hibernian exclamation, which no combination of letters will convey, and pointing, in an excited manner, to an object a few hundred yards in advance of them. "What d'ye see, lad?" inquired Bill Jones, shading his eyes with his hand. The whole party came to a halt, and gazed earnestly before them for a few minutes in silence. "Och!" said O'Neil, slowly, and with trembling earnestness, "av me two eyes are spaking truth, it's a goold digger, the first o' the goold diggers!" And Larry followed up the discovery with a mingled cheer and war whoop of delight that rang far and wide over the valley. At such an unwonted, we might almost say appalling sound, the first o' the goold diggers, who was up to his waist in a hole, quietly and methodically excavating the earth on the river's bank with a pick axe, raised his head, and, leaning on the haft of his pick, scrutinised the new arrivals narrowly. "Hooray, me hearty!" shouted Larry, as he advanced at a gallop, followed by his laughing comrades. "The top o' the morning to ye! It's good luck I'm wishin' ye. How are ye gettin' on in the goold way, honey?" The rough looking, dusty, and bearded miner smiled good humouredly as he replied, in a gentle tone of voice that belied his looks, "Pretty well, friend, though not quite so well as some of my neighbours. I presume that you and your friends have just arrived at the mines?" "Tear an' ages! it's a gintleman, I do belave," cried Larry, turning to his companions with a look of surprise. The miner laughed at the remark, and, leaping out of the hole, did his best to answer the many questions that were put to him in a somewhat excited tone by the party. "Where's the goold?" inquired Jones, gravely, going down on his knees at the side of the excavation, and peering into it. "I don't see none whatsomediver." "The dust is very fine here," answered the miner, "and not easily detected until washed. Occasionally we come upon nuggets and pockets in the dry parts of the river's bed, and the canons of the hills, but I find it most profitable to work steadily down here where the whole earth below the surface is impregnated with fine particles of gold. Many of the diggers waste their time in prospecting, which word, I suppose you know, means looking out for new diggings; but, according to the proverb of my country, I prefer to remain `contented wi' little, and canty wi' mair.'" "Are we far distant from the other miners in this creek?" inquired Ned. "No, you are quite close. You will come upon the colony after passing that bluff of trees ahead of you," answered the Scotchman. "But come, I will show you the way. It's not far from nooning time, when I usually cease work for a couple of hours." So saying, the miner threw his pick axe and shovel into the hole, and led the way towards the colony of Little Creek. "Ain't you afraid some of the bad looking scoundrels in these parts may take a fancy to your pick and shovel?" inquired the captain, as they rode along at a foot pace. "Not in the least. Time was when I would have feared to leave them, for at one time neither life nor property was safe here, where so many ruffians congregated from all parts of the world; but the evil wrought its own cure at last. Murders and robberies became so numerous that the miners took to lynch law for mutual protection. Murderers and thieves were hanged or whipped almost to death with such promptitude that it struck terror into the hearts of evil doers, and the consequence is that we of this valley are now living in a state of perfect peace and security, while in other districts, where the laws of Judge Lynch are not so well administered, murders and thefts are occasionally heard of. Here, if a man takes a fancy to go prospecting for a time, he has only to throw his pick and shovel into his claim or upon his heap of dirt. Author's note: dirt is the name given among miners to the soil in which gold is found, and he will be sure to find them there untouched on his return, even though he should be absent several weeks. Our tents, too, are left unwatched, and our doors unfastened with perfect safety, though it is well known that hundreds and thousands of dollars in gold dust lie within. I do not mean to assert that we have attained to absolute perfection. A murder and a theft do occasionally occur, but such are the exceptions. Security is the rule." "Truly," said Ned Sinton, "you seem to live in a golden age in all respects." "Not in all," answered the Scot. "The terrors of the law deter from open violence, but they do not enforce morality, as the language and deportment of miners generally too plainly show. But here we are at the colony of Little Creek." They rounded the projecting spur of one of the hills as he spoke, and the whole extent of the little valley opened up to view. It was indeed a romantic and curious sight. The vale, as we have said, was narrow, but by no means gloomy. The noontide sun shed a flood of light over the glistening rocks and verdant foliage of the hills on the left, and cast the short rounded shadows of those on the right upon the plain. Through the centre of this the little creek warbled on its course, now circling round some wooded knoll until it almost formed an island, anon dropping in a quiet cascade over the edge of a flat rock; in some places sweeping close under the base of a perpendicular cliff, in others shooting out into a lake-like expanse of shallow water across a bright green meadow, as it murmured on over its golden bed towards the Sacramento. Higher up the valley the cliffs were more abrupt. Dark pines and cedars, in groups or singly, hung on their sides, and gave point to the landscape, in the background of which the rivulet glittered like a silver thread where the mountains rose in peaks towards the sky. Along the whole course of this rivulet, as far as the eye could trace it, searchers for gold were at work on both banks, while their white tents and rude wooden shanties were scattered, singly or in clusters of various extent, upon the wooded slopes, in every pleasant and suitable position. From the distance at which our party first beheld the scene, it appeared as if the miners were not men, but little animals grubbing in the earth. Little or no sound reached their ears; there was no bustle, no walking to or fro, as if the hundreds there assembled had various and diverse occupations. All were intently engaged in one and the same work. Pickaxe and shovel rose and fell with steady regularity, as each individual wrought with ceaseless activity within the narrow limits of his own particular claim, or rocked his cradle beside it. Dig, dig, dig; rock, rock, rock; shovel, 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 was the order of the day, as long as day lasted, and then the gold hunters rested until recruited strength and dawning light enabled them again to go down into the mud, and dig, and rock, and shovel as before. Many, alas! rocked themselves into a fatal sleep, and dug and shovelled their own graves among these golden hills. Many, too, who, although they dug and toiled for the precious metal, had neither made it their god nor their chief good, were struck down in the midst of their heavy toils, and retired staggering to their tents, and there, still clad in their damp garments, laid their fevered heads on their saddles, not unfrequently on their bags of gold dust, to dream of the distant homes and the loved faces they were doomed to see no more, and thus, dreaming in solitude, or watched mayhap by a rough though warm-hearted mate, breathed out their spirits to Him who gave them, and were laid in their last resting place, with wealth untold beneath them, and earth impregnated with gold dust for their winding sheet. Happy, thrice happy, the few who in that hour could truly say to Jesus, "Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee." Just as our travellers approached the nearest and largest cluster of huts and tents, a sudden change came over the scene. The hour of noon had arrived, and, as if with one consent, the miners threw down their tools and swarmed, like the skirmishers of an invading host, up from the stream towards the huts; a few of the more jovial among them singing at the full pitch of their lungs, but most of them too wearied to care for aught save food and repose. Noon is the universal dinner hour throughout the gold mines, an hour which might be adopted with profit in every way, we venture to suggest, by those who dig for gold in commercial and legal ledgers and cash books in more civilised lands. When the new comers reached a moderately sized log cabin, which was the chief hotel of the colony, they found it in all the bustle of preparation for an immediate and simple, though substantial meal. "Can we have dinner?" inquired Ned, entering this house of entertainment, while his companions were unsaddling and picketing their horses and mules. "To be sure ye can, my hearty," answered the smiling landlord, "if ye pay for it." "That's just the reason I asked the question," answered Ned, seating himself in a cask. all available chairs, stool, and benches having been already appropriated by mud bespattered miners, "because, you must know, I can't pay for it." "Oh!" ejaculated mine host, with a grin. "Hard up, eh? Got cleaned out with the trip up, and trust to diggin' for the future? Well, I'll give you credit. Come on, and stick in. It's every man for himself here, and no favour." Thus invited, Ned and his friend squeezed themselves into seats beside the long table d'hote, which boasted a canvas tablecloth and had casks for legs, and made a hearty meal, in the course of which they obtained a great deal of useful information from their friend McLeod the Scotchman. After dinner, which was eaten hurriedly, most of the miners returned to their work, and Ned, with his friend, under the guidance of McLeod, went down to the river to be initiated into the mysteries of gold digging and washing. As they approached several of the claims which their owners were busy working, a Yankee swaggered up to them with a cigar in his mouth, an impudent expression on his face, and a pickaxe on his shoulder. "Guess you've just come to locatin' them diggin', strangers," he said, addressing the party at large, but looking at Ned, whose superior height and commanding cast of countenance proved him unmistakably to be a leader. "We have," replied Ned, who disliked the look of the man. "Thought so. I'm just goin' to quit and make tracks for the coast. 'Bliged to cut stick on business that won't wait, I calc'late. It's plaguey unlucky, too, for my claim's turnin' out no end o' dollars, but I must sell it slick off, so I don't mind to let ye have it cheap." "Is your claim better than the others in the neighbourhood?" inquired Ned. "Wall, I jest opine it is. Look here," cried the Yankee, jumping into his claim, which was a pit of about 8 feet square and 3 deep, and delving the shovel into the earth, while Ned and his friends, besides several of the other miners, drew near to witness the result. Maxton and Tom Collins, however, winked knowingly at each other, and, with the Scotchman, drew back to the rear of the group. The first shovelful of earth thrown up was absolutely full of glittering particles of gold, and the second was even more richly impregnated with the precious metal. Ned and the captain stood aghast with amazement, and Bill Jones opened mouth and eyes to their utmost extent. "Hooroo! Och! goold galore! There it is at last!" shouted Larry O'Neil, tossing up his arms with delight. "Do buy it, Mr Ned darlint." "I needn't turn up more, I guess," said the Yankee, carelessly throwing down his shovel, and filling the earth into a tin bowl or pan. "I'll just wash it out, and show you what it's like." So saying, he dipped the pan into the stream gently, and proceeded to wash out the gold. As this was done in the way usually practised by diggers, we shall describe it. Setting down the tin pan of earth and water, the Yankee dipped both hands into it, and stirred its contents about until it became liquid mud, removing the stones in the operation. It was then moved round quickly with a peculiar motion, which caused some of the top to escape over the edge of the pan with each revolution. More water was added from time to time, and the process continued until all the earthy matter was washed away, and nothing but a kind of black sand, in which the gold is usually contained, remained at the bottom. "There ye are," cried the man exultingly, lifting up a handful of the heavy and shining mixture. $15 at least, and 2 shovelfuls. I'll sell you the claim, if you like, for $200. "I would give it at once," said Ned, feeling at the moment deeply troubled on account of his poverty; "but, to say truth, I have not a farthing in the world." A peculiar grin rested on the faces of the miners who looked on as he spoke, but before he could inquire the cause, Tom Collins stepped forward and said, "That's a first rate claim of yours. What did you say was your charge for it?" $300 down." "I'll tell you what," rejoined Tom, "I'll give you $600 for it, if you take out another shovelful of dirt like that." This remark was greeted by a general laugh from the bystanders, which was joined in by the Yankee himself as he leaped out of the hole, and, shouldering his shovel, went off with his friends, leaving Ned and some others of his party staring at each other in astonishment. "What does it all mean?" he inquired, turning to Tom Collins, whose laughing countenance shewed that he at least was not involved in mystery. "It means simply that we were all taken for greenhorns, which was quite a mistake, and that we were to have been thoroughly cheated, a catastrophe which has happily been prevented. Maxton and I determined to let the rascally fellow go as far as he could, and then step in and turn the laugh against him, as we have done." "But explain yourself. I do not yet understand," repeated Ned, with a puzzled look. "Why, the fact is, that when strangers arrive at the diggings full of excitement and expectation, there are always a set of sharpers on the look out, who offer to sell their claims, as they often say, for a mere song, and, in order to prove their worth, dig out a little dirt and wash it, as you have just seen done; taking care beforehand, however, to mingle with it a large quantity of gold dust, which, of course, comes to light, and a bargain is generally struck on the spot, when the sharper goes off with the price, and boasts of having done a greenhorn, for which he is applauded by his comrades. Should the fraud be detected before the completion of the bargain, as in our case, he laughs with the rest, and says probably he "warn't so cute as usual." "Och, the scoundrels!" cried Larry. "And is there no law for sich doin's?" "None. At least, in most diggings, men are left to sharpen their own wits by experience. Sometimes, however, the biter is pretty well bitten. There was a poor Chilean once who was deceived in this way, and paid $400 for a claim that was scarcely worth working. He looked rather put out on discovering the impostor, but was only laughed at by most of those who saw the transaction for his softness. Some there were who frowned on the sharper, and even spoke of lynching him, but they were a small minority, and had to hold their peace. However, the Chilean plucked up heart, and, leaping into his claim, worked away like a Trojan. After a day or two he hit upon a good layer of blue clay, and from that time he turned out $40 a day for 2 months. "Ah! good luck to him," cried Larry. "And did the sharper hear of it?" inquired the captain. "That he did, and tried to bully the poor fellow and get his claim back again; but there was a strong enough sense of justice among the miners to cause such an outcry, that the scoundrel was fain to seek other diggings." CHAPTer 10. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 11. Gold Washing. Our adventurers count their gains and are satisfied. The Royal Bank of California begins to prosper. Frying gold. Night visit to the grave of a murdered man. A murderer caught. The escape and pursuit. Having escaped from the Yankee land shark, as has been related, our adventurers spent the remainder of the day in watching the various processes of digging and washing out gold, in imbibing valuable lessons, and in selecting a spot for their future residence. The two processes in vogue at Little Creek at that time were the pan and the cradle washing. The former has been already adverted to, and was much practised because the ground at that time was rich in the precious metal, and easily wrought. The extreme simplicity, too, of the operation, which only required that the miner should possess a pick, a shovel, and a tin pan, commended it to men who were anxious to begin at once. An expert man, in favourable ground, could gather and wash a panful of dirt, as it is called, every 10 minutes, and there were few places in Little Creek that did not yield $50 or more to the panful, thus enabling the digger to work out gold dust to the value of about $25 £5 sterling, every day, while occasionally he came upon a lump or nugget, equal perhaps to what he could produce by the steady labour of a week or more. Many of the more energetic miners, however, worked in companies, and used cradles, by means of which they washed out a much larger quantity of gold in shorter time, and in places which did not yield a sufficient return by the pan process to render it worth while working, the cradle owners obtained ample remuneration for their toil. The cradle is a very simple machine, being a semicircular trough hollowed out of a log, from 5 to 6 feet long by 16 inches in diameter. At one end of this is a perforated copper or iron plate with a rim of wood round it, on which the dirt is thrown, and water poured thereon by one man, while the cradle is rocked by another. The gold and gravel are thus separated from the larger stones, and washed down the trough, in which, at intervals, 2 transverse bars, half an inch high, are placed. The first of these arrests the gold, which from its great weight sinks to the bottom, while the gravel and lighter substances are swept away by the current. The lower bar catches any particles of gold that, by awkward management, may have passed the upper one. 3 men usually work together at a rocker, one digging, one carrying the dirt in a bucket, and one rocking the cradle. The black sand, which, along with the gold, is usually left after all the washing and rocking processes are completed, is too heavy to be separated by means of washing. It has, therefore, to be blown away from the gold after the mass has been dried over a fire, and in this operation great care is requisite, lest the finer particles of gold should be blown off along with it. The spot fixed on as the future residence of our friends was a level patch of greensward about a stone cast from the banks of the stream, and twice that distance from the lowest cabin of the colony, which was separated and concealed from them by a group of wide-spreading oaks and other trees. A short distance behind the spot the mountains ascended in steep wooded slopes, and just in front the cliffs of the opposite hills rose abruptly from the edge of the stream, but a narrow ravine that split them in a transverse manner afforded a peep into the hills beyond. At evening, when the rest of the vale of Little Creek was shrouded in gloom, this ravine permitted the last beams of the setting sun to stream through and flood their encampment with rosy light. Here the tent was pitched, and a fire kindled by Tom Collins, he being entrusted with the command of the party, whose duty it was to prepare the camp. This party included Bill Jones, Maxton, and the vaquero. Ned, the captain, and Larry O'Neil went, under the guidance of McLeod, to select a claim and take lessons in washing. "This seems a likely spot," said the Scotchman, as he led his new acquaintances down to the stream, a few yards below their encampment. "You may claim as much ground as you please, for there is room enough and to spare for all at the creek yet. I would recommend a piece of ground of 10 or 12 feet square for each to begin with." "Here is a level patch that I shall appropriate, then," said Ned, smiling at the idea of becoming so suddenly and easily a landed proprietor, and to such an extent. "I suppose we don't require to make out title deeds," remarked the captain. "There's my title deed," cried Larry, driving his pick into the earth. "You are right, Larry," said McLeod, laughing. "No other deed is required in this delightfully free country." "Ah, then, it's quite to my taste. Sure, I niver thought to see the swate spot where I could pick up me property and pick up me fortin so aisy." "Don't count your chickens quite so fast," said Ned. "Maybe it won't be so easy as you think. But let us begin and ascertain the value of our claims. I vote that Larry shall have the honour of washing out the first panful of gold, as a reward for his enthusiasm." "A very proper obsarvation," remarked the Irishman, as he commenced work without further delay. In the course of 10 minutes part of the layer of surface earth was removed, revealing the bluish clay soil in which gold was usually found. The pan was filled with this pay dirt, as it was called, in contradistinction to the surface dirt, which didn't pay, and was taken down to the stream, where Larry washed it out under the eye of McLeod. But he did it clumsily, as might be expected, and lost a considerable amount of valuable material. Still, for a first attempt, it was pretty well done, and his companions watched the result with feelings of excited earnestness, that they felt half ashamed to admit even to themselves. There was mingled with this feeling a sort of vague incredulity, and a disposition to ridicule the idea that they were actually endeavouring to wash gold out of the ground. But when Larry's panful began to diminish, and the black sand appeared, sparkling with unmistakably brilliant particles of reddish yellow metal, they felt that the golden dream was in truth becoming a sober reality. As the process proceeded, and the precious metal began to appear, Larry's feelings found vent in abrupt remarks. "Och, if me two eyes musha, there it is, goold intirely, if it isn't brass. Oh, ye purty little stars! Oh, Larry, it's yourself as'll buy your old mother a pig, and a coach to boot. Hooroo! Mister Scotchman, I misremimber your name. What's that?" Larry started up in excitement, and held up between his forefinger and thumb what appeared to be a small stone. "Ha, friend, you're in luck. That's a small nugget," replied McLeod, examining the lump of gold. "It's worth $10 at least. I have worked often 2 or 3 weeks at a time without coming on such a chunk as that." "You don't mane it!" "Give it me! Hooray!" And the Irishman, seizing the little lump with trembling eagerness, rushed off, shouting and yelling, towards the camp to make his good fortune known to Bill Jones, leaving the pan of black sand unheeded. This Ned took up, and tried his hand at the work of washing. When done, the residue was found to be exceedingly rich, so he and the captain proceeded without loss of time to test their separate claims. Soon after, their obliging friend, the miner, returned to his own claim, further down the valley, leaving them hard at work. That night, when the bright stars twinkled down upon the camp at Little Creek, our gold hunters, wet and tired, but hearty and hopeful, assembled around the fire in front of their little tent among the oak trees. The entire party was assembled there, and they were gazing earnestly, as might be expected of hungry men, into the frying pan. But they did not gaze at supper. No, that night the first thing they fried was a mixture of black sand and gold. In fact, they were drying and blowing the result of their first day's work at the diggings, and their friend the Scotch miner was there to instruct them in the various processes of their new profession, and to weigh the gold for them in his little pair of scales when it should be finally cleared of all grosser substances. As each panful was dried and blown, the gold was weighed and put into a large white breakfast cup, the bottom of which was soon heaped up with shining particles, varying in size from the smallest visible speck to little lumps like grains of corn. "Bravo!" exclaimed McLeod, as he weighed the last pan, and added the gold to that already in the cup. "I congratulate you, gentlemen, on your success. The day's work is equal to $180, about $30 per man. Few men are so lucky their first day, I assure you, unless, as has been the case once or twice, they should hit upon a nugget or two." "That being the case, we shall have supper," cried Ned Sinton; "and while we are about it, do you go, Larry, to mine host of the hotel, and pay for the dinner for which he gave us credit. I don't wish to remain an hour in debt if I can avoid it." "Mr McLeod," slowly said Bill Jones, who, during the whole operation of drying and weighing the gold, had remained seated on a log, looking on with an expression of imbecile astonishment, and without uttering a word, "Mr McLeod, if I may make bold to ax, how much is $180? Bill's calculating powers were of the weakest possible character. "About 36 pounds sterling," replied McLeod. Bill's eyes were wide open before, but the extent to which he opened them on hearing this was quite alarming, and suggested the idea that they would never close again. The same incapacity to calculate figures rendered him unable to grasp correlative facts. He knew that 36 pounds in one day was a more enormous and sudden accumulation of wealth than had ever entered into his nautical mind to conceive of; but to connect this with the fact that a voyage and journey of many months had brought him there, that a similar journey and voyage would be required to reconduct him home, and that in the meantime he would have to pay perhaps 5 pounds sterling for a flannel shirt, and probably 4 pounds or more for a pair of boots, and everything else in proportion, was to his limited intellectual capacity a simple impossibility. He contented himself with remarking, in reference to these things, that "when things in gineral was more nor ordinarily uncommon, and when incomprehensibles was blowin' a reg'lar hurricane astarn, so that a man couldn't hold on to the belayin' pins he'd been used to, without their breaking short off and letting them go spinning into the lee scuppers, why, what then? A wise man's course was to take in all sail, and scud before it under bare poles." Next day all the miners in the colony were up and at work by dawn. Ned and his friends, you may be sure, were not last to leave their beds and commence digging in their separate claims, which they resolved to work out by means of pan washing, until they made a little ready cash, after which they purposed constructing 2 rockers, and washing out the gold more systematically and profitably. They commenced by removing the surface soil to the depth of about 3 feet, a work of no small labour, until the subsoil, or pay dirt, was reached. Of this they dug out a small quantity and washed it, put the produce of black sand and gold into leathern bags, and then, digging out another panful, washed it as before. Thus they laboured till noon, when they rested for an hour and dined. Then they worked on again, until night and exhaustion compelled them to desist, when they returned to camp, dried and blew away the sand, weighed the gold, which was put carefully into a general purse, named by Larry the Royal Bank of Californy, after which they supped and retired to rest. The gold was found at various depths, the dirt on the bed rock being the richest, as gold naturally, in consequence of its weight, sinks through all other substances until arrested in its downward career by the solid rock. Of course, the labour was severe to men unaccustomed to the peculiar and constant stooping posture they were compelled to adopt, and on this second morning more than one of the party felt as if he had been seized with lumbago, but this wore off in the course of a day or two. The result of the second day was about equal to that of the first. The result of the third a good deal better, and Bill, who was fortunate enough to discover a small nugget, returned to camp with a self-satisfied swagger that indicated elation, though his visage expressed nothing but stolidity, slightly tinged with surprise. On the fourth day the cradles were made, and a very large portion of their gains thereby swept away, in consequence of the unconscionable prices charged for every article used in their construction. However, this mattered little, Maxton said, as the increased profits of their labour would soon repay the outlay. And he was right. On the fifth day their returns were more than trebled, and that evening the directors of the Royal Bank of Californy found themselves in possession of capital amounting to $1,150, or, as Tom Collins carefully explained to Bill, about £230. On the sixth day, however, which was Saturday, Larry O'Neil, who was permitted to work with the pan in the meantime instead of assisting with the cradles, came up to dinner with a less hearty aspect than usual, and at supper time he returned with a terribly lugubrious visage and a totally empty bag. In fact, his claim had become suddenly unproductive. "Look at that!" he cried, swaggering recklessly into camp and throwing down his bag. "I haven't got a rap. Faix, the bag's as empty as my interior." "What! have you worked out your claim already?" inquired Maxton. "Troth have I, and almost worked out me own body too." "Well, Larry, don't lose heart," said Ned, as he dried the last panful of sand over the fire. "There are plenty more claims besides your present one. We, too, have not been as successful as before. I find the result is only $50 amongst us all." "That's a sudden falling off," remarked Tom Collins. "I fear the pay dirt is not deep near us. Nevertheless, it pays well enough to keep us going for some time to come. I shall mark off a new space on Monday." "By the way, Maxton," asked Ned, handing over the frying pan to Collins, who soon filled it with a less valuable, but at that time not less needful commodity than gold dust, namely, pork and beef, "how do the miners spend the Sabbath here? I suppose not much better than in the cities." "Here comes McLeod, who will be better able to answer than I am," replied Maxton. The Scot strode into the camp as he spoke, and, saluting the party, seated himself beside the fire. "I've come to tell you a piece of news, and to ask advice," he said; "but before doing so, I may tell you, in answer to your question, that the Sabbath here is devoted to drinking, gambling, and loafing about." "I am not surprised to hear it," said Captain Bunting; "but pray what's in the wind? Any new diggings discovered?" "A new digging certainly has been discovered," replied McLeod, with a peculiar smile, "but not precisely such a digging as one is wont to search for. The fact is, that in prospecting along the edge of the woods about a mile from this to day, I came upon the body of a murdered man. It was covered with stones and branches of trees, which I removed, and I immediately recognised it to be that of a poor man who used to work not far from my own claim. I had missed him for more than a week past, but supposed that he had either gone to other diggings or was away prospecting." "Poor fellow," said Ned; "but how in such a matter can we help you with advice?" "Well, you see, I'm in difficult circumstances," rejoined the Scot, "for I feel certain that I could point out the murderer, yet I cannot prove him to be such, and I want your advice as to what I should do." "Let it be known at once that you have discovered the murdered man, at any rate," said Maxton. "That I have done already." "Who do you think was the murderer?" inquired Ned. "A man who used to live in the same tent with him at one time, but who quarrelled with him frequently, and at last went off in a rage. I know not what was the cause, but I heard him vow that he would be revenged. He was a great coarse fellow, more like a brute than a man, with a black beard, and the most forbidding aspect I think I ever saw. "What was his name?" inquired Bill Jones, while the party looked at each other as if they knew of such a character. Smith was the name he went by oftenest, but the diggers called him Black Jim sometimes. "Ha! Smith, Blackbeard, forbidding aspect! It strikes me that I too have seen the man," said Ned Sinton, who related to McLeod the visit paid to them in their camp by the surly stranger. While he was speaking, Larry O'Neil sat pondering something in his mind. "Mister McLeod," said he, when Ned concluded, "will ye show me the body of this man? Faix, I'm of opinion I can prove the murder. But, first of all, how is the black villain to be discovered?" "No difficulty about that. He is even now in the colony. I saw him in a gambling house half an hour since. My fear is that, now the murder's out, he'll bolt before we can secure him." "It's little trouble we'd have in preventing that," suggested Larry. "The consequences might be more serious, however, than you imagine. Suppose you were to seize and accuse him, and fail to prove the murder. The jury would acquit him, and the first thing he would do on being set free would be to shoot you, for which act the morality of the miners would rather applaud him than otherwise. It is only on cold-blooded, unprovoked murder and theft that Judge Lynch is severe. It is a recognised rule here, that if a man, in a row, should merely make a motion with his hand towards his pistol, his opponent is entitled to shoot him first if he can. The consequence is that bloody quarrels are very rare." "Niver a taste do I care," cried Larry. "They may hang me 2 times over, but I'll prove the murder, and nab the murderin' blackguard too." "Have a care," said Ned, "you'll get yourself into a scrape." "Make sure you are right before you act," added Maxton. Larry O'Neil paid no attention to these warnings. "Are you ready to go, Mr McLeod?" said he, impatiently. "Quite," replied the other. "Then come along." And the two left the camp together, armed with their rifles, knives, revolvers, and a shovel. It was a dark night. Heavy clouds obscured the face of the sky, through which only 1 or 2 stars struggled faintly, and rendered darkness visible. The two men passed rapidly along the little footpath that led from the colony to the more open country beyond. This gained, they turned abruptly to the right, and, entering a narrow defile, proceeded at a more cautious pace into the gloomy recesses of the mountains. "Have a care, Larry O'Neil," whispered the Scotchman as they advanced. "The road is not so safe here, owing to a number of pits which have been made by diggers after gold. They lie close to the edge of the path, and are pretty deep." "All right, I'm looking out," replied Larry, groping his way after his comrade at the base of a steep precipice. "Here is the place," said McLeod, stopping and pushing aside the bushes which lined the path. "Keep close to me, there's no road." "Are ye sure of the spot?" inquired Larry, in an undertone, while a feeling of awe crept over him at the thought of being within a few yards of a murdered man in such a dark, wild place. "Quite sure. I have marked the trees. See there?" He pointed to a white spot on the stem of a tree, where a chip had been cut off, and close to which was a mound of earth and stones. This mound the two men proceeded to break up, and in less than 10 minutes they disentombed the body from its shallow grave, and commenced to examine the fatal wound. It was in an advanced state of decomposition, and they hurried the process by the light of a bright solitary star, whose flickering rays pierced through the overspreading branches and fell upon the ghastly countenance of the murdered man. While thus occupied, they were startled by the sound of breaking twigs, as if some one were slowly approaching. Whispering voices were also heard. "It must be hereabout," said a voice in a low tone. He pointed out the place. "Ho!" cried McLeod, who, with Larry, had seized and cocked his rifle. "Is that you, Webster? Halloo! McLeod, where are you?" In another moment a party of miners broke through the underwood, talking loudly, but they dropped their voices to a whisper on beholding the dead body. "Whist, boys," said Larry, holding up his hand. "You've jist got hold of the bullet. It's flattened the least thing, but the size is easy to see. There's a wound over the heart, too, made with a knife. Now that's what I want to get at the bottom of, but I don't like to use me own knife to cut down." As none of the others felt disposed to lend their knives for such a purpose, they looked at each other in silence. "Mayhap," said the rough looking miner, who had been hailed by McLeod as Webster, "mayhap the knife of the corpse is lyin' about." The suggestion was a happy one. After a few minutes' search, the rusty knife of the murdered man was discovered, and with this Larry succeeded in extracting from the wound over the heart of the body a piece of steel, which had evidently been broken off the point of the knife with which the poor wretch had been slain. Larry held it up with a look of triumph. "I'll soon show you who's the murderer now, boys, if you'll help me to fill up the grave." This was speedily accomplished. Then the miners, hurrying in silence from the spot, proceeded to the chief hotel of the place, in the gambling saloon of which they found the man Smith, alias Black Jim, surrounded by gamblers, and sitting on a corner of the monte table watching the game. Larry went up to him at once, and seizing him by the collar, exclaimed, "I've got you, have I, you murderer, you black villain! Come along wid you, and get your desarts. Call a court, boys, and set up Judge Lynch." Instantly the saloon was in an uproar. Smith turned pale as death for a moment, but the blood returned with violence to his brazen forehead. He seized Larry by the throat, and a deadly struggle would speedily have taken place between the two powerful men, had not Ned Sinton entered at the moment, and, grasping Smith's arms in his herculean grip, rendered him helpless. "What, comrades!" cried Black Jim, with an oath, and looking fiercely round, "will ye see a messmate treated like this? I'm no murderer, and I defy any one to prove it." There was a move among the miners, and a voice was heard to speak of rescuing the prisoner. "Men," cried Ned, still holding Smith, and looking round upon the crowd, "men." "I guess there are no men here," interrupted a Yankee. "We're all gentlemen." "Being a man does not incapacitate one from being a gentleman," said Ned sharply, with a look of scorn at the speaker, who deemed it advisable to keep silence. After a moment's pause, he continued, "If this gentleman has done no evil, I and my friends will be answerable to him for what we have done; but my comrade, Larry O'Neil, denounces him as a murderer, and says he can prove it. Surely the law of the mines and fair play demand that he should be tried." "Hear, hear! Well said! Get up a bonfire, and let's have it out," cried several voices approvingly. The miners rushed out, dragging Black Jim along with them to an open level space in front of the hotel, where stood a solitary oak tree, from one of whose sturdy arms several offenders against the laws of the gold mines had, at various times, swung in expiation of their crimes. Here an immense fire was kindled, and hither nearly all the miners of the neighbourhood assembled. Black Jim was placed under the branch, from which depended part of the rope that had hanged the last criminal. His rifle, pistols, and knife were taken from him, amid protestations of innocence, and imprecations on the heads of his accusers. Then a speech was made by an orator who was much admired at the place, but whose coarse language could scarcely have claimed admiration in any civilised community. After this, Larry O'Neil stepped forward with McLeod, and the latter described all he knew of the former life of the culprit, and his conduct towards the murdered man. When he had finished, Larry produced the bullet, which was compared with the rifle and the bullets in Smith's pouch, and pronounced similar to the latter. At this, several of the miners cried out, "Guilty! Guilty! String him up at once!" "There are other rifles with the same bore," said Smith. "I used to think Judge Lynch was just, but he's no better, I find, than the land sharks elsewhere. Hang me if you like, but if you do, instead of getting rid of one murderer, you'll fill the little creek with murderers from end to end. My blood will be on your heads." "Save your breath," said Larry, drawing Smith's knife from its scabbard. "See here, boys, sure two dovetails niver fitted closer than this bit o' steel fits the pint o' Black Jim's knife. Them men standin' beside me can swear they saw me take it out o' the breast o' the murdered man, and yourselves know that this is the murderer's knife." Almost before Larry had concluded, Smith, who felt that his doom was sealed, exerted all his strength, burst from the men who held him, and darted like an arrow towards that part of the living circle which seemed weakest. Most of the miners shrank back. Only one man ventured to oppose the fugitive, but he was driven down with such violence that he lay stunned on the sward, while Smith sprang like a goat up the steep face of the adjacent precipice. A dozen rifles instantly poured forth their contents, and the rocks rang with a leaden hail, but the aim had been hurried, and the light shed by the fire at that distance was uncertain. The murderer next moment stood on the verge of the precipice, from which he wrenched a mass of rock, and, shouting defiance, hurled it back with a fearful imprecation at his enemies. The rock fell into the midst of them, and fractured the skull of a young man, who fell with a groan to the earth. Smith, who paused a moment to witness the result of his throw, uttered a yell of exultation, and darted into the mountains, whither, for hours after, he was hotly pursued by the enraged miners; but one by one they returned to the creek exhausted, and telling the same tale. Black Jim had made his escape. CHAPTER XII.